The young bikers circled the old man's Harley like vultures, laughing at his worn leather jacket and gray beard. "This ain't a place for grandpas," Jake sneered, not knowing he'd just insulted the Ghost Rider of Vietnam. What happened next would become biker legend. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Hidden Heroes for more tales of respect, honor, and the legends who ride among us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, a roadside institution that had been serving truckers, bikers, and travelers for over 40 years. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the screen door, mixing with the scent of motor oil and leather that always seemed to hang in the air around such places. William Patterson guided his 1975 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide into the lot with the careful precision of a man who'd been riding for 5 decades. At 75, his movements were still fluid, still confident, though his weathered hands bore the marks of countless miles and more than a few close calls. His gray ponytail hung beneath a faded black bandana, and his leather jacket, worn soft by years of wind and weather, bore no patches, no club colors, no indication of the extraordinary story it could tell. The Harley's engine settled into its familiar rumble as William kicked down the stand and slowly dismounted. The bike was pristine despite its age, every chrome surface polished, every mechanical component maintained with military precision. It wasn't just transportation. It was a time machine, carrying memories of jungle paths and midnight runs through enemy territory that most people couldn't imagine. As William removed his helmet and ran a hand through his thinning hair, the low growl of multiple engines announced the arrival of less welcome company. 6 motorcycles roared into the parking lot in a formation that spoke of practiced intimidation rather than organized riding. These weren't weekend warriors or touring enthusiasts. They were young men wearing their rebellion like armor, their bikes loud and aggressive, their attitude matching their machines. Jake Morrison, 28 years old with arms covered in tribal tattoos and a beard that tried too hard to look dangerous, led the pack. His Harley-Davidson Street Glide was all noise and flash, modified more for intimidation than performance. Behind him rode his crew: Tommy, barely 21 and eager to prove himself; Marcus, the enforcer with dead eyes and scarred knuckles; Diesel, whose nickname came from his habit of stealing fuel; and 2 others whose names mattered less than their willingness to follow Jake's lead. They pulled up in a loose semicircle around William's bike, engines revving unnecessarily, the sound echoing off the diner's walls like thunder. William didn't flinch, didn't hurry his methodical process of securing his helmet to his bike and adjusting his jacket. He'd faced worse intimidation from people far more dangerous than these posturing children. "Well, well," Jake called out over the noise of the engines, finally killing his motor. "Looks like someone's grandpa got lost on the way to the retirement home." The others laughed on cue, shutting down their bikes in a coordinated display of theatrical contempt. William continued his preparations, checking his bike's security with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to preparing for reconnaissance missions. "Hey, old man," Tommy called out, emboldened by Jake's example. "This ain't exactly a Sunday ride to church. You sure you're in the right place?" William straightened slowly, his gray eyes taking in the 6 young men surrounding him. He'd seen their type before, in bars from Saigon to Sacramento, young, angry, looking for respect they hadn't earned and validation they couldn't find in themselves. The difference was, back in Vietnam, such men usually learned quickly that survival required more than attitude. "Just stopping for coffee," William said quietly, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned when to avoid trouble. "No harm intended." Jake dismounted and swaggered closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "No harm intended," he mimicked in a high, mocking tone. "Ain't that precious? Boys, I think Grandpa here thinks he's a real biker." Marcus stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow across William's bike. "Nice ride, Pops. Vintage. Bet it's worth some serious cash. Shame if something happened to it." "Shame," agreed Diesel, running a finger along the Harley's pristine chrome. "Real shame if it got scratched or something." William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The bike wasn't just a machine. It was his connection to a time when his skills had mattered, when his courage had saved lives, when the name Ghost had meant something more than just an old man's fading memory. "Gentlemen," William said, his voice still controlled but carrying a new edge, "I don't want any trouble. Just let me get my coffee and I'll be on my way." Jake laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Oh, you'll be on your way all right. But first, maybe you ought to pay a toll. Call it a parking fee, or better yet, Call it respect money. This is our territory, old man, and old guys like you don't belong here." The screen door of the diner squeaked open, and Maria Santos stepped onto the wooden porch. At 55, Maria had seen her share of trouble in 40 years of serving coffee and keeping the peace. Her dark eyes took in the scene instantly, and her expression hardened. "You boys causing trouble in my parking lot," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd thrown out men twice her size and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. "No trouble, senora," Jake called back with false charm. "Just having a conversation with Grandpa here about parking etiquette." Maria's gaze shifted to William, and something in her expression changed. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been awe. She'd heard the stories, seen the photographs, knew the legend that had walked through her door more times than she could count over the past decade. "William," she said softly, "you need any help?" The use of his name caught Jake's attention. "William, is it?" "Well, William, here's the deal. This is our spot, our diner, our territory. Old guys like you make the place look bad. Bad for business, if you know what I mean." Tommy, eager to impress, stepped closer to the Harley and deliberately knocked over the kickstand, causing the heavy bike to lean dangerously. "Oops," he said with a grin. "Clumsy me." That was the moment something shifted in William Patterson. For decades, he'd chosen the path of peace, avoiding confrontation, letting younger men have their victories, while he quietly went about his business. But there were lines that couldn't be crossed, disrespect that couldn't be ignored, and moments when the past demanded to be acknowledged. William moved with a speed that belied his 75 years, catching his bike before it could fall and smoothly setting it upright. The motion was fluid, economical, the reaction of a man whose survival had once depended on split-second responses to unexpected threats. "Son," William said quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you just made a mistake." Something in his tone made Jake pause. There was no anger in the old man's voice, no bluster or threat. There was something far more dangerous, certainty. "Oh, did I?" Jake recovered his swagger. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Call the police? Write a strongly worded letter?" William slowly removed his leather jacket, folding it carefully and placing it on his bike seat. Beneath it, he wore a simple black t-shirt that revealed arms still corded with muscle despite his age. More importantly, it revealed scars, the puckered mark of a bullet wound on his left shoulder, the thin line of shrapnel damage along his right forearm, and a jagged scar across his back that spoke of an explosion survived at close range. "Boys," Maria called from the porch, her voice urgent, "you need to stop this right now. You have no idea who you're messing with." "We're messing with some old has-been," Marcus sneered, cracking his knuckles. "What's he gonna do, bore us to death with war stories?" William reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Maria Santos cross herself, a small, worn photograph. He held it up so the young bikers could see it clearly. The image showed a much younger version of himself, lean and dangerous-looking, sitting astride the same Harley they'd been mocking. He wore military fatigues and carried weapons that spoke of serious business. Behind him, barely visible in the jungle shadows, were other men on motorcycles, all bearing the insignia of a reconnaissance unit. 1969, William said simply. 1st Cavalry Division, Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol. We called ourselves the Ghost Riders. The parking lot went quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs. Ghost Riders, William continued, his voice carrying the weight of memory, were the guys they sent when regular patrols couldn't get the job done, deep jungle, behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and raising hell. We rode modified Harleys because they were quiet, reliable, and could handle terrain that would break other bikes. Jake's swagger was beginning to fade, but he wasn't ready to back down. "So what? You rode around Vietnam 50 years ago. Big deal. That was then, old man. This is now." William nodded slowly. "You're right. That was then. But you know what they say about old habits." He tucked the photograph back into his pocket and looked each of the young men in the eye. "The thing about being called Ghost is that people never quite forget the name. Even after the war ended, even after I came home, even after I tried to blend in and be just another guy on a bike, the legend had a way of following me." Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," William said, beginning to walk slowly around his bike in a pattern that seemed casual, but positioned him strategically between the young men and any potential exits. That for the past 50 years, I've been the guy other bikers call when there's trouble they can't handle themselves. When some gang thinks they own a piece of highway, when some punk thinks he can intimidate people just because he's young and loud, when someone needs to be reminded that respect is earned, not taken. Marcus stepped forward, his fists clenched. You threatening us, old man? Not threatening, William replied, his movements now clearly those of a man with combat training. Educating. See, the problem with your generation is you think age means weakness. You think gray hair means you can push someone around. You think because I'm 75, I must have forgotten how to handle myself. He paused directly in front of Jake, close enough that the younger man could see the steady confidence in his eyes. What you don't understand is that I didn't survive 3 tours in Vietnam by being lucky. I didn't earn the nickname Ghost by running away from fights. And I didn't spend 50 years riding these highways by letting punks like you dictate terms. Jake tried to maintain his aggressive posture, but something in William's presence was unnerving him. This wasn't the frightened old man he'd expected to intimidate. This was something else entirely. You boys have 2 choices, William continued, his voice still quiet but now carrying unmistakable authority. You can apologize for disrespecting my bike, show proper respect for someone who served his country, and ride away with your dignity intact. Or, he let the word hang in the air. Or what? Diesel demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. William smiled, and for the first time, the young bikers got a glimpse of why enemy soldiers had once whispered his name in fear. Or you can find out why, even at 75, people still call me Ghost. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats. Then, from inside the diner, came the sound of a phone being dialed. Maria's calling the state police, William said conversationally. They know me here, have for years. Sheriff Reynolds served under me in 71. Deputy Carson's daddy rode with the Ghost Riders. You want to explain to them why you're harassing a decorated veteran? Jake's face was reddening with frustration and growing uncertainty. This is bullshit. You can't prove any of this. For all we know, you bought that jacket at a thrift store and made up some story. William nodded thoughtfully. You know what? You're absolutely right. I could be lying. He reached into his other pocket and produced something that made the blood drain from Jake's face. A military medallion on a ribbon, tarnished with age but unmistakably genuine. Silver Star, William said simply, for actions above and beyond the call of duty during Operation Delaware, April 1968. Want to see the citation? Tommy was the first to crack. Jake, man, maybe we should just shut up, Jake snapped, but his authority was crumbling. The old man wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear, wasn't reacting the way intimidation victims were supposed to react. Tell you what, William said, pocketing the medal. I'll make this easy for you. I'm going inside to have my coffee and maybe some of Maria's famous apple pie. When I come back out in about 30 minutes, I expect to find my bike exactly as I left it, and I expect you boys to be somewhere else, preferably learning some manners. He started walking toward the diner, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Jake, next time you want to call someone grandpa like it's an insult, remember this. Some grandpas earned their gray hair in places you couldn't imagine, doing things you couldn't handle, so punks like you could grow up free enough to mouth off without consequences. As William reached the porch steps, Maria held the door open for him. Coffee's fresh, she said loud enough for the young bikers to hear, and I just happened to mention to Sheriff Reynolds that some out-of-town boys were causing trouble. He said he'd be right over. William paused in the doorway and looked back at the 6 young men still standing around their bikes. Boys, he called out, a word of advice from someone who's seen more road than all of you combined. The highway's got room for everyone, but respect has to be mutual. Ride safe, ride smart, and remember that every old biker you meet has stories you can't imagine and skills you hope you never have to see. He disappeared into the diner, leaving the 6 young men standing in uncomfortable silence. Through the window, they could see him settling into a booth, calmly ordering his coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. Jake looked around at his crew, seeing doubt in their eyes for the first time. The old man's confidence, his casual mention of law enforcement connections, the evidence he'd produced, it all pointed to a reality none of them had expected. This is stupid, Tommy muttered. I ain't waiting around for the cops to show up. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Yeah, maybe we should hit the road. Diesel was already walking toward his bike. Dude seemed legit. Did you see those scars? And that metal looked real. One by one, they mounted their motorcycles. Jake was the last to move, his pride warring with his growing certainty that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. As he climbed onto his bike, he caught sight of William through the diner window, calmly sipping coffee and chatting with Maria as if intimidating 6 men half his age was just another Tuesday morning. The young bikers fired up their engines and rode out of the parking lot without another word, their earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable silence. As they reached the highway, Tommy couldn't resist looking back at the old Harley sitting alone in the morning sun. 30 minutes later, William emerged from the diner, patting his stomach contentedly. Maria followed him onto the porch. "That apple pie was outstanding, as always," he said, pulling on his jacket. "William," Maria said softly, "were you really, the stories I've heard." William smiled and walked to his bike, running a gentle hand along its chrome. "Some stories are best left as stories, Maria. But I'll tell you this. Every scar on this bike matches one on me, and we've both got more miles ahead of us than behind us." He mounted the Harley and kicked it to life, the engine settling into its familiar, confident rumble. As he prepared to leave, a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot. The window rolled down, revealing a man in his 60s wearing a badge and a knowing smile. "Morning, Ghost," Sheriff Reynolds called out. "Maria said you had some excitement." "Nothing I couldn't handle, Tommy," William replied. "Just some young folks who needed a history lesson." Reynolds chuckled. "Well, if you ever need backup, you know where to find me. Sarah's making her famous chili tonight if you want to stop by." "I'll think about it," William said, pulling on his helmet. "Tell her I said hello." As he rode out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, William Patterson felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of reminding the world that legends don't die just because they get old. They just wait for the right moment to remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. 20 miles down the road, he passed the 6 young bikers pulled over at a truck stop, huddled around Jake's phone as they searched for information about Vietnam War veterans and ghost riders. William smiled beneath his helmet and gave them a friendly wave as he cruised past, his Harley purring with the confidence of a machine and rider who had nothing left to prove. That evening, the story began making its way through biker bars and motorcycle forums. The day 6 tough guys learned that some old men carry their dangerous years quietly, waiting for young fools to mistake age for weakness. Within a month, it had become the kind of legend the motorcycle community treasures, a reminder that the highway has always belonged to those who respect it, regardless of age. And William Patterson, the ghost rider of Vietnam, continued his journey, carrying his stories and scars like silent medals, a living reminder that heroes don't always announce themselves with noise and flash. Sometimes they just order coffee and wait for the young to learn what the old have always known. Respect is earned through actions, not attitude. Have you ever judged someone by their age, only to discover you'd underestimated their experience and capabilities? Tell us in the comments below. And if stories like William's remind you that wisdom and strength come in many forms, subscribe to Hidden Heroes for more tales of the legends who walk quietly among us. Because the next time you see a quiet older person, remember that they might be carrying stories of courage and sacrifice that would humble the loudest voice in the room. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of service, respect, and the quiet strength of veterans who continue to inspire us long after their wars have ended. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.